promulgated the document, it created a firestorm. A leader from an association of Protestant mainline denominations called it the most important encyclical ever promulgated in the entire history of the papal succession. He said, "It will mark a new era in wide and deep-going revolt against ecclesiastical control. It will bring nearer a revolt within the Roman Catholic Church." He said this attempt by the Church with its autocratic domination to interfere with private and intimate matters will push it closer to its own inevitable collapse. This exercise of hierarchical power would certainly be met with indignant repudiation by Catholics themselves. A doctor said the document was confusing, especially when it came to the issue of the health and welfare of the mother. He disagreed with the encyclical that claimed contraception violates nature. And he observed that the declining birth rate among Catholics indicated that the rule was being more observed in the breach. A pastor of a non-denominational church in New York said the encyclical was an example of a 10th century mind at work on 20th century problems. Strangely, when many Catholic bishops and priests were asked for their comments, they declined. However, a prominent Catholic layman from England agreed to be interviewed. He said the encyclical compels us to squarely face the question whether the world would really be happier under the sexual anarchy advocated by the vociferous minority or living in conformity with the rules prescribed by the Church. He argued that all the problems swirling around the issue of sex were the result of the neglect of Catholic morality, not because of it. The quarrel of the sexes is not occasioned by the Church, he said. It is due to not taking the advice of the Church, which tells the husband, honor your wife, and the wife, honor your husband. The encyclical in question was Casti Connubii, as you know, authored by Pope Pius XI. So that was 1930. The layman was G.K. Chesterton. So I'll make a more serious point later in my talk about this document, but I begin with this observation to show that the uproar associated with the publication of Humanae Vitae 50 years ago was not entirely unprecedented. These things have been going on for a long time. In fact, I just on the airplane ride here yesterday and this morning from Washington began reading this autobiography of Bella Dodd, the woman in the American Communist Party, early 20th century. And my eyes are open at how much what we're facing with now was going on then in the early 20th century. So it's been going on for a long time, but those of you my age or older, probably for you as well, like for me, the memories are still very vivid of those tumultuous years after Humanae Vitae. They were years that turned out to be filled with empty promises. There were promises of liberation and a new social order in the midst of social upheaval. The advent of the birth control pill right at the same time made it seem like a done deal. The new normal was baked into society. There are really no differences between men and women other than a few incidental anatomical features. And now women are finally free to be just like men in every way, even to the point of being able to get away with being just as sexually irresponsible as men. Sex is for fun was the new narrative, and now women can have just as much fun as men without the consequence. After all, they want it just as much as men. It was an age of glee. People are finally freed from the strictures and shackles of an oppressive moral code and can indulge themselves without incurring the scorn of society. That was the promise. Somehow, though, it didn't work out that way. Now, 50 years later, we are witnessing the explosion of news stories about sexual harassment of women by men in all walks of life: entertainment, politics, news media, sports, you name it. In my own country of the United States, the unending revelations of such stories gave birth to what they call the Me Too movement over a year ago, a movement of women who are sharing the secrecy or shattering the secrecy of the sexual harassment they have suffered from men, and are especially using social media to speak out and protest against it. And it has remained headline news all this time. Why is it that it's overwhelmingly women who suffer from sexual harassment? We don't really think of men suffering when a woman makes uninvited sexual advances toward him, do we? The very suggestion draws a chuckle, because we all know that for some reason, men kind of like that, but not women. It's different when a man makes such advances toward a woman. For 50 years, the culture has been telling us the opposite, and now all of a sudden, women are standing up in protest against it. I think this has come as a shock to a lot of men, given the unrelenting narrative of the sexual revolution. Everyone is admitting that this is a big problem, but no one dares to suggest that maybe it's the very narrative that is wrong. That is the then and now background of what we are about at this symposium. So I have been asked to speak about what a bishop can say to his priest about these matters. The tumultuous era ushered in by the infamous 60s found priests on the front line, not only in regards to contraception and the moral teachings of the church, but dealing with profound confusion regarding Catholic doctrine and liturgical practice. Priests trained before the council were schooled in the theology of the manuals, and they were trained to follow very precise rubrics for every action of the liturgy. That entire apparatus was abandoned overnight. Theologians spoke in entirely new categories, and free-willing liturgies became the order of the day. Social upheavals in the wider culture found their echo in an ecclesial culture, which consciously and deliberately moved out of the so-called Catholic ghetto in order to engage the world. The Council Fathers envisioned a church capable of preaching the gospel with confidence to the many diverse cultures of the modern world. They rightly saw that it was not enough for the church to preserve the tradition she had received. She was founded by Christ precisely for mission and needed to engage the exigencies of proclaiming the gospel in a modern idiom to the modern world. Unfortunately, in the process, the social confusion present in the wider culture, in the wider world, found its way into the culture and world of the church as well. What added to the difficulties of priests was that the teaching of Humanae Vitae was not only challenged by their parishioners, but as you know, by leading voices in the church. Not only prominent theologians, but you know this very well in this part of the world, even by bishops. They joined their voices with the objections. Recently, Father Serafino Lanzetta chronicled the dissent. This is in an article in L'Espresso Settimo Cielo. He said, "Cardinals, bishops, and episcopates took an active role in this rebellion. The Primate of Belgium, Cardinal Leo Joseph Sunens, after the publication of the encyclical, managed to make the whole Belgian episcopate publish a declaration in opposition to Humanae Vitae, supposedly in the name of freedom of conscience. This declaration, together with one formulated by the German episcopate, served as a template for the protests of other episcopates. John C. Heenan of Westminster, Cardinal Heenan, described the release of Pope Giovanni Battista Montini's encyclical on the transmission of life as the greatest shock since the Reformation. Cardinal Bernard Alfrink, together with 9 other Dutch bishops, even voted in favor of the Independence Declaration, which invited the people of God to reject the ban on contraception." Father Lanzetta suggests that opposition to Humanae Vitae helped to create the context of the sexual abuse crisis currently afflicting the church. I don't think a more honest assessment could be made, or really even obvious, if we think honestly and deeply about this. Now, mind you, I'm not speaking here about the psychological disorder of pedophilia, the attraction to prepubescent children. That scourge, sadly, has always been around. But the current sexual abuse crisis we are facing now has to do with pubescent and post-pubescent minors, which is something quite different. Admittedly, this too has always been a problem in society and even in the church. But in the last 50 years, the incidents of such abuse have exploded at an unprecedented rate. The rejection of Humanae Vitae ultimately comes down to rejection of a proper and ordered understanding of the purpose of human sexuality. Once the pleasure principle becomes the overriding consideration, the door is open for deviance of every kind. This crisis, as you probably know, is being felt very keenly in the United States, resulting from a convergence of a number of distressing news reports. There's the report of the abuse perpetrated by the former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and its cover-up as he climbed the ecclesial ladder. The publication of a report of a grand jury in the state of Pennsylvania, although unverified, but exposing horrendous stories of abuse of minors by priests in the past and the mishandling of some of those cases. And then, as you know, the testimonies of the former nuncio to the United States, Archbishop Vigano, alleging networks of homosexual prelates and cover-up at the highest levels of church authority. And now, more recent reports of abuse of minors by priests and mishandling of such cases, sometimes even since 2002, when the U.S. bishops approved the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, which put strict procedures in place with systems of accountability, and adopted the so-called zero-tolerance policy. So a cleric is removed from ministry for just one sexual act of sexual abuse of a minor. There actually has been an awful lot of progress made, and the number of incidences has been reduced. There have been a few, and these have been reported lately. But I think the church in our country, Catholic Church in our country, has led the way in how to address this issue. But nonetheless, with all these other stories converging, it's moving our lay people in the United States to make their voices heard, and they demand that they be heard. So over the past few weeks, I have been holding meetings with various groups of parishioners throughout my archdiocese to hear their concerns and answer their questions. The divisions we hear about in the church manifested themselves to me very clearly throughout the course of these listening sessions. Now, some of you may have read about or even watched on YouTube my intervention at our bishops' conference meeting in Baltimore the other day, so you already heard what I'm going to say here, but I'm pretty sure most of you had something more interesting to do, so this will be news to you. So there were clearly two camps that emerged that showed the divisions. According to one, the problem is homosexuality in the clergy, and no one is admitting it, and it has to be admitted, addressed, and eradicated if this problem is going to be solved. According to the other camp, the problem is a celibate all-male hierarchy, and the solution is to admit married men as priests and bishops and to ordain women to all ranks of holy orders, because women would never allow such a thing to happen, abuse to go on. So you see, these are it's a rather exaggerated, and both really in a way are overly simplistic, but there is some truth to both of these analyses, which I would like to reflect on. So, for example, it can't be denied that there are many in the clergy who have a homosexual orientation, and the percentage has increased over the past several decades, and that this has been a problem in seminaries, and the acting out was enabled. The study that the U.S. bishops commissioned on the nature and scope of the problem of sexual abuse of minors by the highly reputable John Jay College of Criminal Justice found that 80% of the abuse was perpetrated against pubescent and post-pubescent males. But they concluded that the abuse was perpetrated not by priests who had a clearly identified orientation, but rather priests who who were confused about their sexual identity and acted out with the children they had most readily available, which back then would have been boys because only boys served Mass. Other professionals in the field, though, disagreed with this conclusion, asserting that there is a clear link of abuse with prevalence of homosexual clergy. A recent study by a social science researcher at the Catholic University of America, the Reverend Paul Sullins, found through his research that there is a high correlation. However, it's a standard principle of social science that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Causation is a more complex thing, and there are priests who have a homosexual inclination who do not abuse, and heterosexual priests who do. So Father Sullins is definitely onto something here, and it's an important first step to getting to the root of the problem. But we can't directly equate a connection of causality, so deeper analysis is necessary. Now, this other camp. We do have to admit sometimes that works of priests, and especially bishops, can act what in the United States we colloquially refer to as an old boys club, rather than as men selflessly serving the church, instead serving their own self-interests. But this is a human problem. It's not exclusive to men. I could think, for example, there's far more abuse, at least in the United States, that goes on in public schools than in the church, far more. And public schools have women in leadership positions at all levels. And it can't be ascribed to celibacy either. Surveys show that Catholic clergy do not abuse minors at a higher rate than clergy of other religions, and actually at a lower rate than some other religions. And it is common knowledge that the vast majority of abuse occurs in the home, that is, by men who are not celibate. So there's not even a correlation between celibacy and sexual abuse of minors. I found, though, that these facts do not satisfy some people who are trying to push their pet issue. But we cannot take a simplistic answer to a complex problem, solve a complex problem. And incidentally, by the way, I recently had over to my home for dinner 3 very smart and faithful women in the church who are making great contributions to the church from the positions they hold in teaching and administration in the church. So when this topic came up in conversation, it was just me and the 3 very smart women. When the topic came up in conversation, I mentioned how I admit bishops can act like an old boys club, and this can do a lot of harm. And then I added, but I've seen old girls clubs too. And their response to me was, and they can sometimes do more harm than the old boys clubs. So it's not unique to men. I bring this all up to give my analysis. My analysis is really what I said a moment ago. Father Lanzetta is right. A distorted, materialistic, pleasure principle notion of human sexuality undermines the virtue of chastity. What we need is to reclaim formation in the virtue of chastity, properly understood, loving in the way God created love to be, at every moment and in every way affirming the intrinsic dignity of the other, and never using the other as a means to one's own selfish ends, as St. John Paul II so poignantly taught us. Sadly, the dominant culture sees chastity as a negative, an oppression. Indeed, some young people have never even heard the word, let alone have an even incorrect concept of it. But properly understood, chastity is a foundational virtue because it forms one into a person capable of giving and receiving love. I find it interesting for the calls now for claiming chastity and purity, especially among the clergy, when there's been so much resistance to it, when I've had my own experience, but other bishops have had their experiences trying to proclaim this and instill it in the levels of education. And we receive a lot of protest from our own people, sometimes our own teachers, against it. So there's this resistance, but now there's a claim for it. So maybe you have an opportunity to help people understand just how foundational this virtue is. It is a sin to be ashamed of this teaching of the church. and to refrain from speaking and teaching about it. We have a moral obligation to form our people, and especially our young people, in this virtue. If we have conviction in this being true, we will know how to do it with courage and compassion. It is an understatement to say that we bishops and priests find ourselves in a very difficult situation. Given these latest revelations, the moral credibility of the Catholic Church has been severely damaged. And the vast majority of sometimes even practicing Catholics find their moral values and thinking about issues facing the Church shaped far more by the secular culture than by church teaching. If there was ever any doubt, my experience of those listening sessions cleared that up. What can a bishop say to his priests as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae? My observations thus far have been to set me up for my comments to follow, the essential purpose of this presentation. So as I was writing these reflections to follow now, I pictured myself speaking to a group of priests. So I sometimes use the second person, but I'm thinking of speaking to priests, so I'll try to qualify that when I come to those parts of the talk. First and most importantly, we who are bishops need to reinstill in our priests a spirit of discipleship that embraces the cross. Much of the malaise facing the Church in, as it likes to call itself, the developed world, is due to a tendency in every aspect of the life of the Church for the past 50 years to empty the cross of its meaning. In large issues and small, accommodation has been the order of the day. This tendency may be explained in part by either the reality or the perception that Catholic life before the Council was excessively burdensome. Well, be that as it may, whatever people might think, what we have seen in the past 50 years is a lessening and even a disappearance of a spirit of sacrifice in the life of the Church. Ignatius Press, located in the city of San Francisco, by the way, recently published a book entitled Priests, What Lies Ahead, a dialogue of Cardinals Carlos Granados with Luis Ladaria, George Pell, Livio Melina, and Charles Chaput. I was struck by Cardinal Pell's observations on this very point I've been trying to make here. He said, "Progress in Christianity comes from people embracing the cross. And through the cross, you come to redemption and rejoicing and resurrection. Jesus did not have only success when he preached the gospel. He was rejected and crucified and assured us that the world would hate us. By preaching and accepting the cross, by our Christian witness of charity and forgiveness, this is the way to bring salvation to the world and come to the resurrection." Cardinal Pell gets us to the crux of the matter, pun intended. So much of the rejection of Humanae Vitae and the whole body of the Church's teaching on responsible parenthood and sexual morality in general is really a rejection of the cross. Our fallen human nature instinctively wants to flee from the cross. And yet, as he points out, it is the only way to salvation. The last thing we need in the world today are excuses for people to flee from the cross. By embracing the cross, one grows in the virtue needed to, as St. Paul put it, be set free from slavery to corruption and share in the glorious freedom of the children of God. Second, we bishops must help our priests recover confidence in the moral vision and profound teachings of the Catholic faith. They must be equipped to present persuasively what the Church teaches on faith and morals. This means, among other things, learning or relearning how the Church's moral vision has grown organically over the centuries. This touches on the essential importance of that hermeneutic of continuity when it comes to interpreting the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and subsequent documents. I began this talk by making reference to the encyclical of Pope Pius XI, Casti Connubii. This important document provides the context for understanding Humanae Vitae, the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, Veritatis Splendor, and Amoris Laetitia. If our priests are not well grounded in what the church teaches and why, they will be ill-equipped to hand on that teaching to the people entrusted to their care. And such teaching is one of the most essential ministries of a parish priest. We all have known people, and perhaps you all, and maybe for some it's even been your own personal experience, who have been won over by the surprising wisdom of the church's timeless teaching. Many grew up indoctrinated in the typical secular orthodoxy that is forced on us today, all those myths of the sexual revolution I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and they were convinced of the rightness of it, only to learn that they were duped after discovering what the church really teaches and why. Often this happens after they have done damage to themselves and others in living by the secularized code of conduct. And Father Loya mentioned this in his talk. This is, I think, a common experience among many priests who are dedicated to these teachings. That the most common response is, why didn't anyone tell me this sooner? It would have saved me so much suffering. Such people, though, make the most ardent disciples and provide a much-needed witness for many cradle Catholics. These young people who discover the teaching are amazing. Some were ardent and convicted atheists who discover the teaching of the church and accept it totally. And now the most fervent Catholics, inspiring Catholics. These young people are amazing. And you know, for those of good faith who do not understand these things or maybe don't have much faith, but are willing to be challenged and think things through and search sincerely and objectively for the truth when they see others understanding this, a light goes on. So we who are bishops and priests alike, and really indeed anyone who teaches in the name of the church, must be animated by the conviction that the Catholic understanding of human nature is true. It is based both on reason and on faith. Armed with that conviction, we will not be cowed in the face of opposition, ridicule, or neglect of church teaching. To those who oppose Catholic teaching on contraception and a whole host of other moral topics, sad to say that includes some prominent Catholics, they oppose it on the grounds that such teaching is burdensome and unrealistic. I would simply invite them to consider the alternative. We do not have to imagine what the world would look like when perennial moral values are abandoned. When Pope Paul VI issued Humanae Vitae, he prophesied dire consequences if the natural moral law and the truth of Catholic teaching were abandoned. He was dismissed by many as a prophet of doom, out of touch with all of the advantages brought to the world by modern science. If anything, though, the events since then have not only showed that his predictions were right on the mark, even as foresightful as they were, they in some ways fell short of the reality that we are experiencing now. So I'm sure you're all familiar with those predictions for number 17 of Humanae Vitae, when he spoke about how young people need incentives to keep the moral law, and it's an evil thing to make it easy for them to break the law, and that a man who will forget the reverence due to his wife and disregard her physical and emotional equilibrium and several other things. You're all familiar with that, right? I can read it for you if you want, but I wrote it out here, but I think you're all familiar with that. He also foresaw that governments would begin to force this on their populations. So there's no question that following the moral teaching of the gospel in the church, in a sense, it creates burdens. And we who are pastors of souls must do all in our power to assist people in bearing the burden of discipleship. But if anyone imagines for a moment that the alternative moral vision symbolized by artificial contraception offers a panacea, he or she need only look around. Embracing the cross is difficult, but dropping it is catastrophic. And if that is not already obvious from sheer observation, we have 50 years of social science research with reams and reams of data linking myriad social ills to the scourge of fatherlessness and family breakdown, higher rates of dropping out of school, of incarceration, of drug use, promiscuity, involvement in crime, and on and on and on. And I would include, as Dr. Wojtowska mentioned, it also includes there are no good men left. That's one of the dire consequences of this whole breakdown. So it is a burden to live by the cross, but as one lives by it, the burden becomes lighter. One begins to appropriate it, becomes a part of who they are, and then they experience that true freedom of excellence in the moral life. So armed with the facts and equipped with a deep understanding of God's vision for human flourishing and the Church's teaching that helps us appropriate it, we can preach and teach the truth with conviction, courage, and compassion. It is incumbent to every bishop, priest, and deacon to preach on the hard issues of our time. The urgency of our times demand that we preach consistently on pro-life issues of our day, countering the culture of death, abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, embryonic stem cell research, and so forth. These, of course, have to be addressed in their proper context of church teaching and the context of popular mentality. They all have their own particular considerations within the context of church teaching. And the same can be said about the pressing issues affecting marriage and family life, responsible parenthood and the evils of contraception, the integrity of marriage as between a man and a woman, the moral and social ills of divorce, and so forth. Along with this goes the need to educate our people on the principle of worthiness to receive Holy Communion. The loss of the sense of the sacred, even toward the most Holy Eucharist, has carried with it a loss of understanding of what it means, seen it as simply as gesture of welcome and belonging, rather than Christ's one perfect sacrifice made present to us in this moment, and of which we must be worthy to receive, that is, in a state of grace. I shudder to think how many Catholics nowadays have never even heard that phrase, state of grace, let alone know what it means. So a bishop needs to say these things to his priests, but he can only do so if he has done this himself. It is challenging, but my own experience teaches me that it can be done in a way that is pastorally sensitive and respectful of those who have been harmed or duped by the secular orthodoxy. So, for example, in preaching about abortion, it is important to acknowledge the harm that this does to women and how it contributes to undermining the worthiness of women and the esteem with which they are to be held, bearing in mind that many listeners nowadays in the priest's congregation will have been personally affected by it. In treating the topic of contraception, it is helpful to cite scientific facts on the harm it can do to the woman's health, and also, by the way, on the harm it does to the environment. We're having more and more studies revealing that. And how it is ultimately disrespectful to women. So it all goes together in this harmonious whole. What both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, although I think it was St. John Paul who first mentioned it, this concept of human ecology. The physical, the social, the moral, and the spiritual all go together. It is morally wrong because of the physical harm it does and the corruption it brings about at the spiritual level, which is the deepest part of who we are. Yes, I would tell my priests, there will be people who will get angry at you. Some people may even walk out. Personally, this has never happened to me, but I know it has happened to others. Far more often, though, I have found that people express appreciation for it. Some people have been waiting for years, even decades, to hear these truths preached from the pulpit. Others who were misled have their eyes opened when it's preached skillfully, and also their minds opened. They are now open to hearing more about the beauty of the truth that the church holds out for us. As I am fond of telling priests and seminarians, future priests, if you have never preached a homily that left you thoroughly exhausted, that made you feel like it took a pound of flesh out of you, then you have never really preached. In addition to preaching, there is teaching. I spoke earlier about the need to form our people in the virtue of chastity. There is no more urgent need with regard to our ministry to young people than this right now. If we do not commit ourselves to helping them develop this virtue, then we are setting them up for a lifetime of heartache. Do this in concrete ways. In schools where you have influence, I'm talking to my priests, in your religious education programs, your programs of preparing people for sacraments, especially confirmation and matrimony. This goes a long, long way in helping our people live an authentic Catholic life. This is especially true with marriage. We must bear in mind that when a couple presents themselves to the church to be married, 90% of their marriage preparation has already been done. It happens in the home, in their school, and in the wider society. That is why you have to attend to their remote marriage preparation. This reality came home to me in a very vivid way many years ago now when I was a pastor. The parish was in a small town in a rural area, and there was a small a Catholic high school run by the diocese. A beloved teacher there, religion teacher, was quite fervent in his faith, and he did a wonderful job forming his students in the faith. He had 5 daughters, so he's quite a father and quite a teacher. I remember still a couple coming to me for marriage preparation who were both alumni of the school. The groom was the father of a family active in the parish, and I knew the family well. They were friends of mine. So I knew he came from a good, solid Catholic family. I did not know the girl's family, but it was apparent she came from a similar family. So they already had an advantage there. But when I brought up the topic of instruction in natural family planning at the first session, as I always did in preparing couples for marriage, they already understood it. Mr. Jacobelli had taught it to them in their high school religion class. They were familiar with it, and they're familiar of the basics of how it works and why it is right. And they were looking forward to learning more exactly the mechanics of how to do it. I realized how much easier our work would be if we gave our children and young people good, solid formation before they graduate from school. We're working on it. Formation, though, does not only happen with words. Even more powerfully, it happens through symbol. Early on in my talk, I made a passing reference to this by mention of free-willing liturgies becoming the order of the day. Now, I know that was a major understatement, but we know what has happened. The most foundational formation of our people happens at worship. You're all familiar with the old maxim, lex orandi, lex credendi. The importance of right worship cannot be emphasized enough in forming our people in the faith. It is no coincidence that widespread liturgical abuses are occurring as the church's moral teachings are being rejected. Banal and narcissistic worship produce banal and narcissistic people. But here we must begin with ourselves, priests and bishops. We hear a lot about clericalism these days. Clericalism in this negative sense is really nothing more than clerical narcissism. We have to admit that this is a serious problem, and it's a widespread problem in the church, and it has even infiltrated the sanctuary. I recently had the great pleasure of hosting Cardinal Francis Arinze, the former prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments in San Francisco. In one of the talks he gave, he spoke about liturgical participation. I was happy he made a point that I myself have often emphasized. To celebrate Mass facing the people well, the priest must be very disciplined. When Mass is celebrated facing east, it's obvious where the focus of attention is to be. But when celebrating facing the people, even consciously with the intention of trying to gauge more active participation from the assembly, unless the priest is very careful, he can easily slide into a performance mentality. All the worse when this is his intention, that is, to be the focus of attention at Mass. This is unseating God, and the priest putting himself in God's place. This, though, is really symbolic of what the priest can do with his whole life. For even in these tumultuous times, people still generally respect priests, and they show them special courtesy. I found that people still love their priests and they trust them. But the priest can easily take advantage of this by making himself the center of attention, or carving out for himself a nice, comfortable life by allowing himself to be indulged by the good people of God. God created us to worship him, and we are who God created us to be when we worship him, not each other. The priest then must avoid two extremes, both of which are pitfalls in priestly life he can easily fall into. One is to be an ideologue. Pope Francis has told us, bishops, that he does not want ideological bishops. He wants pastoral bishops. I would say the same to my priests. I don't want ideological priests, I want pastoral priests. But I would expand upon that. I also don't want lazy priests, such as those who connive and content themselves with a comfortable life. Those are two extremes, and neither is authentically human, much less pastoral, and both take the easy way out. The ideologue simply imposes his ideas on everyone else, regardless of how it will be received, and without trying to understand the people who have been entrusted to his pastoral care. The lazy priest, on the other hand, simply lets people do and believe what they want. He avoids conflict at all costs and builds everything around his personal life, his ministry included. Notice how both of these avoid genuine human interaction. That is utterly unpastoral. To be pastoral means to be present. That's what love is like. Love delights simply in being present to the beloved. A priest cannot possibly hope to help his people grow in holiness if he is not present to them. His loving pastoral presence to them at those most critical moments of life, loss of a loved one, birth of a child, marriage, times of crisis, all of this prepares the ground for him to, when necessary, challenge them for their own ongoing conversion. So, talking to priests, make no mistake, truly doing the pastoral thing will always be harder. It will always place demands on you, sometimes inconvenient and uncomfortable demands. It will require you to work hard. This reality is especially true when it comes to liturgy. It will take a lot of hard work and spiritual stamina to teach your people what the council and all the post-conciliar instructions have really asked us to do. Things like preservation of Latin in the liturgy as the common liturgical and cultural patrimony of all Catholics, giving Gregorian chant the first place in liturgical services, teaching people to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass and the simpler melodies of this chant. In other words, the way Mass is celebrated here at the International Theological Institute. You're modeling it. And there's so much more to do, especially when it comes to giving adequate preparation to lay people who exercise different ministries at Mass: musicians, lectors, extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, altar servers, and so forth. It is not enough just to train them. They must be given formation. And our people in general must be taught how to worship. I think we've lost that. We need to re-educate them on the importance of silence, of dressing respectfully, of conducting themselves with reverence and dignity at worship. Here again, the bishop cannot tell his priest this unless he has first done it himself. From my own experience as a pastor, I know this is possible. It takes a lot of hard work, much patience and perseverance, but progress can be made. And I found that it raises people's consciousness about the sacred dignity of the liturgy, such that when they attend Mass elsewhere and see how sloppy things are done, they notice it, whereas they would have not noticed it before. Again, this is the principle of teaching more powerfully through symbol than with words. This is something else that came to me vividly in that parish where I was a pastor, because I was emphasizing all of this dignity and dress and so forth, and people would notice when they go to Mass elsewhere, they drive to San Diego for Mass and see how things were done different. I remember my nickname there was Sam. I was Sam when I was growing up, so they called me Father Sam. One family told me, oh, we went to this parish and this girl went up to take the collection. She was wearing short pants and chewing gum. We said, oh, Father Sam would never allow that. So we raise their consciousness and we begin to make a change for the good. But it involves avoiding these two extremes and being truly pastoral and what that fully means. Of course, for the priest to take the pastoral approach, he must be pastoral. That is, he must have acquired the virtues necessary to be so: humility, chastity, generosity, courage, gentleness, compassion, wisdom, and so forth. So as I come to the conclusion of my reflections, I would say that the most important thing that a bishop can tell his priests is to encourage them to attend to their own personal formation. A life of prayer, especially being faithful to praying the Liturgy of the Hours, daily rosary, making a holy hour before the Blessed Sacrament every day, observance of penitential practices, and especially fasting on Fridays, which is still a day of penance in church practice and law, availing themselves frequently of the sacrament of penance, continuing to grow in learning and understanding by studying, reading, and attending worthwhile conferences and symposia on topics affecting church life and ministry, such as this one. And I would add, when I talked about the fallout of Humanae Vitae and all that dissent, even among bishops at the beginning of the talk, I think that's something we need to take heart when we see so much being done this year to mark the 50th anniversary. I've gone to a number of special conferences, and there were many others I know held in the United States. This would not have happened 50, even 40 years ago. So I think we need to look on the bright side. Things are within the church, in a lot of ways, things are improving. There's sort of this internal renewal beginning to happen. And thank God for the older people who have held the line all these decades, and the younger people who understand it are fervent for it. But a priest who attends to this personal formation will be able to do what needs to be done for this renewal of the church and for the proclamation of the gospel as I have outlined it here, by being a minister of word and sacrament, forming his people in faith and virtue through sound preaching and teaching, and promoting and celebrating reverent and beautiful liturgies. As our Lord tells us in the gospel, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. There is a great catch waiting out there. There is an abundance of goodwill. As I visit the parishes, I see this. As I alluded to earlier, I see that our people love their priests, and they love their parish. They love the church. So they will respond well to a pastor who truly cares for them and moves them along the path of holiness by using all of the means at his disposal as appropriate to the occasion, if he has their trust: persuasion, admonition, encouragement, solidarity, but above all, personal example. May the time we have spent here help us to be such ministers of God's people.